for today's webinar. This is Ryan Weiser here from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I would first like to just welcome all of you to today's webinar, in which staff from both Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as well as Argonne National Lab will be summarizing some work that we published a couple of weeks ago now on the impacts of variable renewable energy, or VRE, and namely wind and solar, on bulk power system assets, pricing, and costs. Now, before we get started, I would like to run through just a couple of logistics. First, all of you participants on the webinar are in listen-only mode and will remain in listen-only mode for the duration of today's presentation and discussion. That being said, we do hope to have some time for questions and answers, Q&A, towards the end of today's 75-minute marathon webinar. And so if you do have any questions during the course of the presentation, we certainly invite you to send those questions in, and please do so via the question and answer box that you should see on the left-hand side of your screen. You can send those questions and broadcast them to everybody, or you can send them just to the co-presenters. Now, to be fair, we may not be able to cover the full set of questions that we receive in the time allotted for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And if that is the case, we certainly invite you also to reach out to one or more of the authors of the work after the webinar to address any residual questions that we're just unable to get to during the course of today's discussion. Second, for those of you who are gluttons for punishment and just can't get enough of the work that you'll be hearing a summary about today, the PowerPoint slides, the full reports on which those slides are based, and even a recording of this webinar will be available on the LBNL website at the link noted on this slide. Those of you joining the webinar may be aware that actually our team published 2 reports a couple of weeks ago, both of which were conducted, at least initially, within the context of the recent Department of Energy staff report on electricity markets and reliability. One of those reports, a much longer report, is focused on the impacts of VRE on the U.S. bulk power system, and the second and much shorter and narrower report emphasizes trends and drivers for power plant retirements. For the purpose of today's webinar, I do want to emphasize that we will be primarily focusing on the first of those 2 papers. We will briefly touch on just one aspect of the work conducted related to power plant retirements, but in the interest of time, we're not going to be covering that topic comprehensively. So for those of you who are especially interested in power plant retirement trends and drivers, I'd certainly invite you to glance through our brief work on that topic at some other time, as well as, frankly, the DOE staff report itself, which contains quite a lot of good and new analysis on some of the core drivers and data for power plant retirement trends in the United States. Focusing on the report that will be the center point of today's webinar, though, let me begin by thanking my Berkeley Lab and Argonne National Lab colleagues who participated in the work, Andrew Mills and Joaquin Seal here at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and Todd Levin and Auden Badarud from Argonne National Lab. And in fact, you'll be hearing from many of those folks during the course of the presentation today. I'd also, of course, like to thank our U.S. DOE colleagues who, of course, both funded this work, but also provided great comments on earlier iterations of the work that you'll be hearing about today. As for the origin story of the report that we'll be focusing on today, it was to a degree born out of necessity. It was originally intended to feed some content into the DOE staff report on electricity markets and reliability that came out several months ago now. And given the pretty tight timeline that existed around that Department of Energy study earlier this year, I imagine that those on the webinar could appreciate that we did all that we could in a very narrow window of time, but that there are clearly limits in terms of the material and analysis that we could pull together and conduct during that brief time window. And as a result, the work that you'll be hearing about today might be considered preliminary or maybe a first cut at some of the questions that we were interested in trying to explore and questions that we were seeking to answer. And in fact, we'll end our presentation today by highlighting some of the additional follow-on work that our team has planned in the coming year, in part building on the foundation of the work that you'll be hearing about during today's webinar. So with those slides as context, our webinar today will be organized in the following fashion. I will first go over some introductory slides that introduce the motivation and scope of the work in question, as well as what we did not cover. I will then also briefly discuss some of the economic underpinnings that helped frame our work. And then I will turn it over to, at least initially, Andrew Mills from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, who will summarize the work that he led to try to understand the historical observed impacts of variable renewable energy on the bulk power system. Andrew will then give way to our Argonne colleagues, who will describe the literature review that they conducted to try to better understand the prospective future impacts of variable renewable energy on the bulk power system. And then finally, the Argonne crew will hand the mic back to Andrew, who will offer some brief conclusions and highlight some of the planned work that we'll be conducting in the coming year that seeks to build on the foundation of the work that we'll be presenting today. With those presentations then complete, we do hope to have a few minutes remaining at the end of the presentation or the end of the webinar for questions and answers. And so again, I very much encourage folks to, as you think of them, insert your questions into the chat box in the left-hand side of your screen. So starting with the introduction and scope for this work, the background here is pretty straightforward, namely wholesale power prices and also the composition and operation of the bulk power system have witnessed substantial changes in recent years. Annual average wholesale prices, of course, have declined substantially over the last decade. That's illustrated in the graph in the upper left-hand side of this particular slide. The retirement of thermal generation assets have also increased in recent years, especially over the last decade. That's illustrated in the small little graphic in the upper right-hand side of the slide. And then finally, the operation of the generation fleet has changed. Capacity factors for coal units in particular have declined over the last decade or so, whereas capacity factors for natural gas combined cycle plants have increased. Concurrent with those trends, of course, has been a sizable growth of wind and solar generation, and that sizable growth and the concurrence of the trends leads to the obvious question of to what degree variable renewable energy, again, VRE or wind and solar, as well as the policy incentives supporting those generation resources might be contributing to some of these underlying bulk power system trends. So given that question, our work sought to, where possible, synthesize available literature and data, and even conduct some new analysis to try to explore the degree to which growth in variable renewables has in the past or might in the future impact bulk power system assets pricing and costs. And we emphasize possible impacts on wholesale power market prices, the operation of other power plants, and incentives for generation asset retirements. Now, the focus of our work was on the impacts of variable renewables on those metrics, but we, of course, also acknowledge that there were a number of other broader trends occurring over a similar time frame that can also affect these same variables, notably the shale gas revolution, lower load growth than previously anticipated, environmental regulations, and other factors. And so in a number of places, we seek to frame the impacts of VRE within a broader context of other possible drivers for some of those same underlying trends. Finally, as it relates to report scope, I should note that the report ends in a final chapter by highlighting some of the implications of our work for the so-called system value or system costs of variable renewable energy, sometimes described as the limits of using a levelized cost of energy metric. That chapter is an important one, and the topic is certainly a rich area of further exploration. However, I want to be clear that we'll just not be covering that chapter in this webinar, not because it's uninteresting or unimportant, but simply because we have too much other content to cover. So I certainly invite and welcome folks to review that chapter. Happy to chat about it offline, but I do want to acknowledge that we will, unfortunately, in the interest of time, not be covering that topic in today's session. I'd also like to be clear about the many issues that we do not address in this paper. So we've got like a list of caveats here on this screen. First, we don't analyze the impacts of variable renewable energy on specific power plants. Instead, we're really focusing on national and regional system level trends. Second, though our work does offer, for sure, a useful, I hope, first-order assessment of the issues at hand, these issues are complicated, and there's certainly a lot more work to be done in this space. Third, our work doesn't seek to comprehensively address issues related to short timescale variations in variable renewables and the technical characteristics of variable renewables as they affect power system reliability and VRE integration. Fourth, we don't directly address market design issues. Market design issues obviously are a hot topic. I imagine we'll get some questions on those issues during the Q&A session, but I want to emphasize that that wasn't the focus of this particular work. And then finally, while we do seek to draw some general findings from our work, it of course should be recognized that many of these issues are highly context dependent, and so there is always some risk of overgeneralization. According with those caveats, each of our chapters actually has a future research directions section tagged onto the end of it. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll end this presentation by highlighting a couple of different spin-off analyses or extensions that our team will be conducting in the coming year to build on the foundation that you'll be hearing about today. So moving on now to the chapter on economic underpinnings and expectations. Frankly, this chapter is really just a literature review that introduces some of the concepts that are then further analyzed in a quantitative form in the chapters that follow. And given that, I don't want to spend too much of our precious time on this more qualitative or contextual material. However, the chapter does highlight the fact that the physical and cost characteristics of variable renewable energy are, at least to a degree, somewhat unique. First, of course, wind and solar output are variable, affected by prevailing weather conditions. And second, to a degree, also uncertain, notwithstanding the fact that forecasting skill has improved over time. Third, renewable resource quality does vary by location, and so VRE projects are location constrained. And fourth and finally, wind and solar both have very low marginal costs of production. Basic power system economics, and frankly decades and decades of research from the US, Europe, and elsewhere, have clearly demonstrated that those characteristics of VRE mean that increasing VRE will have certain physical impacts on the bulk power system, namely a greater amount of total generation capacity needed to meet planning reserve margins, potentially increases in shorter-term reserve requirements in order to meet shorter-term reliability constraints in the operational time frame, a general tendency for dispatchable thermal units to have lower capacity factors, and an overall move towards more flexible sources of generation and load relative to less flexible ones. Moreover, those same VRE characteristics will also have linked implications on wholesale power prices, namely as variable renewable energy increases, the temporal and geographic patterns of wholesale prices will change, price volatility may increase, and overall average wholesale prices may be suppressed due to the low marginal cost of variable renewable sources. Now, again, in this chapter, we simply lay out those basic principles and directional effects, but one of the core goals of our work, especially in the following two chapters, was to try to highlight the degree to which these effects have been observed already in the U.S. power market, our historical analysis that you'll be hearing from Andrew Mills next, and also whether those impacts might grow in the future as variable renewable energy penetrations grow, if they do grow. And that's the work that Argonne will be describing a little later in this presentation. Before I turn it over, though, to my other co-authors to go through those two chapters, I want to also emphasize that in addition to the physical characteristics of VRE, it's of course also important to recognize that variable renewable sources are supported by a variety of state and federal incentives. And that support has two distinct effects. First, as more variable renewables are deployed, first, as or given those renewable policies of course support a greater volume of variable renewable energy deployment than would be the case absent that policy support. So there's a deployment effect of these policies, more VRE than in a no policy scenario. But second, there is also an effect of that support on the bidding behavior of variable renewable energy projects. In particular, to the extent that policy support is delivered as a production-based payment of some form, production tax credits or renewable energy credits, for example, it can create some incentive for variable renewable energy sources to bid into wholesale markets at negative prices. Now, even here, though, some care is needed. Specifically, wind and solar projects are by no means the only resources that bid negative prices into wholesale markets. And in fact, some of our later analysis that you'll see demonstrates a wide variety of projects that continue to generate even when wholesale prices turn negative. And of course, nor are wind and solar resources the only ones that currently benefit or that have in the past benefited from federal, state, or local incentives. This is clearly a complex area, and perhaps because of that complexity, there's an active debate within the energy sector as to whether either of those effects, either the effect of policy incentives on the deployment of VRE or the effect of those incentives on market price bidding, is considered a quote-unquote market distortion. That is a debate that exists. It's a debate that we identify in the report, though not surprisingly, it's also not a debate where we put our own flag in the sand. We describe the nature of the debate, but certainly don't seek to resolve it on our side. So with that intro and framing then, I'd now like to turn it over to Andrew Mills at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He'll start to dig into some of our core findings within this work, specifically focused on the observed historical impacts of variable renewable energy on the bulk power system. So Andrew, why don't you just take it away?
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So in this chapter, what we do is we first summarize the impacts of growth of wind and solar on annual average wholesale prices. And throughout this chapter, we only examine the impact to locational marginal prices. We don't look at the impact of VRE on capacity market prices or on ancillary service prices. And the structure of the chapter is that we start with an assessment of estimates of average impacts from various studies, all focused on the U.S. Then we turn to our own assessment of the impacts using a simple supply curve model. We focused on quantifying the relative contribution of VRE to the observed reduction in wholesale prices, both in the ERCOT area, which has seen high growth in wind, and in the California ISO, which has seen high growth in solar. This simple supply curve model allows us to put the impact of VRE into the context of other drivers for wholesale power prices. Looking at these averages is helpful for understanding the overall impact, but it really only tells us part of the story. So in the following sections, we then move away from looking at just the averages to then look at the impact of VRE more on price volatility and on geographic variation in prices. We then briefly look at the relationships between regional VRE growth and recent thermal power plant retirements. Finally, the chapter then discusses potential directions for future research, which I'll include in the summary at the end of our presentation. Here we summarize the various estimates of the impact of VRE on average wholesale prices from earlier studies available in the literature. Several studies have quantified this merit order effect, where wholesale prices decline as wind and solar push out the supply curve, lowering wholesale prices, at least in the near term. Each row in this table represents a study that has conducted an empirical analysis to estimate this effect for some region within the U.S. The average penetration of VRE in the study is shown in the fourth column, and the resulting estimate of the decrease in wholesale prices is shown in the last column. The studies at the top of the table, led by C.K. Wu, use a detailed econometric techniques to estimate the impact of wind and solar in various regions of the U.S. Across these studies, we see some variation in the estimates depending on the VRE technology, the penetration of VRE, the region is the focus, the time period, and other various factors. But across all these studies, we see that most of the estimates are about $5 a megawatt hour or less. A few very relevant studies are also listed on the right-hand side of the table, though we don't include these in the table since the authors did not attempt to estimate the impact of VRE on average prices across the entire year. Instead, they focus sometimes just on impacts in specific portions of the year. In order to put these results into the context of other factors that might have impacted wholesale prices, we conducted our own analysis focused on average wholesale prices in CAISO and ERCOT. In our analysis, we developed a simple supply curve model to estimate wholesale prices in 2016 and then again in 2008. The wholesale prices are based on finding the intersection of the supply curve and demand in each hour, We then take the average of these prices over the whole year. This very simple model reproduces observed wholesale prices at major trading hubs fairly well. The observed average prices in the hubs are shown in the black dots for each of the years in the two markets. The blue bars then show what our simple model estimated as the average wholesale prices for those markets. And you can see that the black dots and the blue bars agree pretty well in terms of the magnitude and also the change between 2008 and 2016. So to then estimate the relative contribution of various factors to this observed change in wholesale prices, we held all of these factors at their 2016 level and then just changed one at a time back to whatever its level was in 2008. The green bars then represent the contribution of factors that decreased prices between 2008 and 2016, while the red bars show the contribution of factors that caused prices to increase between 2008 and 2016. And since we see that there's some nonlinearities between these different factors and prices, the sum of these individual contributions is not the same as the total change in prices when all of the factors were changed together. So hence we're left with this small interaction term, which is included at the right-hand side in light green. We see that the largest contributor by far to the decline in wholesale prices in these two markets was the decrease in natural gas prices over this time frame. The decrease of natural gas prices between 2008 to 2016 contributed to 85 to 90% of the price decline. VRE, on the other hand, contributed to less than 5% to the price decline. The contribution of VRE to the decline in average prices is also on par with the impact of some of the other factors, like other new generation additions. One reason for these relatively modest impacts that we observed in our analysis is the very flat supply curve with recent low natural gas prices. In the full report, we also estimate the same effect for each factor if we flip the analysis around and hold factors all at their 2008 level and just change one at a time to its 2016 level. The higher gas prices in 2008 means that the supply curve at that time was considerably steeper. And so, but even with this change in analysis and doing it both ways, we again find that the contribution of VRE to the price decline is still modest, though somewhat larger than what's shown here. Additional details behind the methods and data used to create the supply curve are included in the appendix of the full report. So these previous results only looked at the impacts of VRE on average prices, but now in the rest of this we'll start to move beyond these average prices to look at impacts at particular times and particular locations. This chart here shows the frequency of negative prices at major trading hubs in the US. The frequency of negative prices in the real-time market is what's shown by the blue bars, and the frequency of negative prices in the day-ahead market is what's shown in orange. Outside of California, negative prices occur almost exclusively in the real-time market. And in California, there are some few instances where we saw negative prices even in the day-ahead market. The penetration of wind and solar in each of the markets for each year is shown by the green dots. We do see some tendency for negative prices to be increasing in frequency with the increase in VRE, but this trend is not clear-cut. For example, in some regions, we see negative prices are actually less frequent in 2016 than some of the previous years, even though VRE penetration has grown year after year in all of these regions. In CAISO, we see that the highest frequency of negative prices occurred actually in 2011, prior to the recent very rapid growth in solar. That said, I should note that the frequency of negative prices in the California ISO is expected to be quite high in 2017 due to high solar and high hydro conditions. Which also then brings us to the next question, which is what resources were generating during those times of negative prices? These plots on this slide show the dispatch of generation during all positive price hours on the left-hand part of each of the plot, and then also during what's the negative price hours on the right-hand side of each plot. The group of figures on the left shows the capacity factors of generation by type and how that changes between positive and negative price hours, whereas the group of figures on the right shows the absolute generation level from these different generation types. Overall, we see that negative prices tend to be correlated with times of low system load and high VRE generation. We also see that coal and gas plants tend to produce less during negative price hours, although they still are producing during these hours in some cases. But we do see also that nuclear plant dispatch is insensitive to these negative prices, which means that nuclear is also contributing to these observed negative prices in some cases. To gauge the impact of these negative prices on the average wholesale electricity price, we compared the observed average price, which is what we actually saw in blue. So the average price for every year that we actually observed is in blue. And then in red, what we do is we replace any of those negative prices with zeros instead. And then we see how much the wholesale average price changes, and that's what's shown in red. And we see that the negative prices did not have an impact on average prices at most of these major trading hubs, except for what we see in the California ISO. And here prices were about 6% lower due to negative prices in 2015 and about 3% lower in 2016. Beyond the impacts at these major pricing hubs, we also see evidence of greater impacts of VRE on prices and negative prices in particular, where in clusters where the generation is located, in particular when it's far away from the load and there's transmission constraints. So here we focus on two particular examples. One of them is wind in West Texas, which is in the left-hand column of charts, and then also wind in the northern Illinois region near a large nuclear plant called Quad Cities, which is in the right-hand column. The frequency of negative prices over time is shown in the top row, and the average prices in each year are shown in the bottom row. The effect of negative prices on average prices is shown by these dark bands that you can see at the top of the bars in the bottom row. And earlier, when I was presenting results at the major trading hubs, we saw fairly infrequent negative prices at the North Hub in ERCOT. We also saw infrequent negative prices at the Western Hub in PJM. And here we show that result again. In the top bar, you can see that in the blue. But now we start to contrast that with the greater frequency of negative prices that were observed in the West Hub of ERCOT, where a significant share of the wind is located, and even greater frequency of negative prices at the 10 largest wind nodes in West Texas. One interesting observation in the top left chart is that the frequency of negative prices actually decreased in West Texas as the CREZ transmission between West Texas and the load centers to the east was built out through 2013. Negative prices are again rising, but not yet to the level observed prior to the completion of the CREZ transmission. Similarly, in northern Illinois, we see more frequent negative prices in northern Illinois than we saw in the Western Hub in Pennsylvania. These negative prices are again even more frequent at the large wind nodes than at the northern Illinois hub, but they're most frequent at the nuclear plant in green. The growth in negative prices is happening in line with the growth of wind in northern Illinois, as shown in the blue dots. In the figure in the bottom right, the dark green bands show that the negative prices were having a fairly noticeable effect on the average real-time prices at the Quad Cities node. Finally, we looked at the degree to which recent retirements, and recent we mean between 2010 and 2016, were correlated with the growth in VRE in the region. To put this in context, we also looked at the correlation of recent retirements with several other factors, including things like regional load growth rates, regional planning reserve margins, sulfur dioxide emission rates of plants, the age of plants, and other factors. The charts on this slide show the correlation of recent retirements, which is what's shown by the vertical axis on each of these slides, with the correlation with various factors on the horizontal axis. Examples of strong predictors of recent retirements are shown in the top two charts. The chart on the left shows that regions with higher sulfur dioxide emission rates tended to see more retirements of coal plants. The chart on the upper right similarly shows retirements were more common in regions with large planning reserve margins during the same period. In contrast, the figure in the bottom shows no real clear relationship between VRE penetration in the region and the frequency of thermal plant retirements. We caution that this simply indicates that there's no major pattern to date, though VRE growth may have been a factor in the decision to retire some specific plants. With that, I'll now turn it over to Auden Badarou to continue this discussion, to now focus on prospective impact.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. I hope you can all hear me. So the purpose of this next chapter in the report and in the webinar is to try to look ahead into the future, what may happen if the amount of renewables continue to grow. And the approach we took here was to review relevant literature focusing on U.S. regions and systems. As I'm sure many of you know, there is a quite wide body of literature on integration of renewables that have come along in the last 10-15 years. But most of those studies tend to focus more on the cost implications, the reliability implications. Only a subset looks more into market implications for prices, revenues, and so on. So those are the ones that we've tried to focus on here. And as was mentioned at the outset, this report was put together in a short timeline, so it's not a comprehensive review. We covered the studies that we found most relevant given the time we had available. The studies, they can basically be split into two categories. So they look into a future scenario with more renewables. In one of the categories, they keep the configuration of the rest of the generation fleet fixed regardless of the renewables penetration level, whereas in the second category, adjustments are made to the rest of the system in response to more renewables in the system. Some issues to keep in mind as you go through the results is that, as I said, it's a selective set of studies that we looked at. It doesn't cover the full range. Most of these studies, they assume some sort of fully competitive market using what we would say is a simplified modeling approach, typically modeling the system, optimizing the entire system by minimizing the expected cost. So it doesn't go into any potential strategic interactions in the market. The studies, they obviously use a number of different models, time horizons, underlying methodologies, and also the very different input data. So because of that, it's not appropriate to make direct comparisons between the studies. The way to look at this is more to look at the trends and how they differ or are similar between studies and regions. Also, most of the studies that we have been looking at look into short to medium term impacts. With that, we mean a time horizon of typically, say, 10-15 years into the future, where if you look at the very long term, where presumably sort of the entire generation portfolio is adjusted or recalibrated entirely in the context of the changing landscape. Still, as you will see, the penetration levels that we are looking at here are considerably above what's currently present in most regions in the U.S. The report also does include some directions for future research in this domain. So with that high-level overview, I'll hand it over to my Argonne colleague, Todd Levin, who will go through some of the findings of this review.
Great, thank you, Audun. So moving to the next slide here, we show here two tables of the different studies that were considered by our analysis. As Audun mentioned, this is not a comprehensive list of all studies in this area. We focused primarily on studies that contain data that we could use to extract concrete quantitative metrics that could be compared both within and across the studies. So I will go into those a little bit more in more detail on the following slides. And as he mentioned, they fall into two primary categories. One, studies where the thermal capacity was held fixed as the VRE penetration changed, and then studies where the thermal capacity was allowed to vary with the VR penetration. And just to reiterate his disclaimer or caveats, that each study, of course, has lots of its own assumptions. So as we go through the data, I will try to identify trends and speak in generalities, but it's often the case that each statement I make will not necessarily apply to each study. And it's also, because of this, it's important to remember that it may not be necessarily appropriate to compare results across studies. Rather, our intention was more to look at trends within each individual study as the VRE level changed. Okay, so this first slide examines the changes in LMP and market prices as VRE penetrations changed for a number of the studies. I say LMP because we specifically looked at studies that analyzed a market price using, as Auden mentioned, generally some sort of least cost approach to approximate competitive market outcomes. So these studies, these are not studies that looked at total system costs or total generation costs over the course of a year or something to that effect. Because you see quite a large variation just in terms of the size of the y-axis, and that again is because of the differing timelines and differing assumptions that were used for each study. Some of these studies reported a load-weighted average cost. I would say most of them. You can see in the legend, it might be a little hard to read, but there's a few studies that have an asterisk after it, and those reported a simple average cost. But regardless, getting to the main trend that is identified here is that most of these studies are in at least somewhat agreement that prices, market prices tend to decrease with increasing VRE penetration. And then referring to Auden's caveat that many of these studies are conducted more for short or medium-term timelines and do not necessarily reflect long-term equilibrium conditions where the whole generation mix might change in response to price signals. So we generally expect that in the longer term, some of these price responses might be somewhat mitigated due to the adjustments in the equilibrium capacity mix. Okay, this slide we show the similar results across the different studies looking at the capacity factors of 3 different classes of thermal plants: coal, natural gas combined cycle, and combustion turbines. The clear trends, particularly for coal and the combined cycle units, is that their capacity factors are found to decrease with increasing renewable penetration. That trend was seen to some extent for combustion turbines, although not. Some of the studies also found more of a neutral or a moderate effect. Again, this effect can also be partially due to the fact that many of these studies added VRE capacity on top of existing thermal generation without necessarily retiring any of that existing generation, which could lead to overcapacity and could be partially responsible for some of this decrease in capacity factor. Nuclear units aren't included here because they were typically modeled as inflexible units, and therefore the capacity factors often don't change in the models. Here we look at a few different studies that analyze the impacts of VRE on thermal cycling costs. This metric is a little bit tricky to compare across different studies because it's often calculated in different ways or different factors are included. In general, you can see the studies that we surveyed tend to show an increasing cycling costs with increasing VRE penetrations. Some of the factors that were included in these costs, although not necessarily considered by all studies, increased ramping that can lead to increased wear and tear and maintenance costs, increased unit startups and shutdowns, which can add fatigue and also fuel costs, and similar impacts from longer idle times, more cold starts, which can add to wear and tear and additional fuel costs. What was not generally included in this calculation was the impact of units potentially operating at a lower output level, which would generally decrease their operational efficiency. And note also that the cycling costs are reported per unit of output, per megawatt hour. So the capacity factor reduction that we saw in the previous slide may also factor in to some of these increased costs if the units are generating less output for each of their startups or shutdowns, for example. Okay, here on the top, a couple of studies where we were actually able to obtain hourly price data. You might notice that's because these were studies that were conducted by the 4 authors of this report, actually, so we had all of the raw data. and we were able to analyze the price variability. And you can see in each case, with the kind of one outlier, a general increasing trend of variability, price variability with increasing VRE penetration. And similarly, on the bottom plot, several studies that looked at ancillary service prices. Again, these are competitive market clearing prices, not average costs of provision. And this plot specifically looks at frequency regulation and again shows a general increasing trend for regulation prices, although there's some variation there. We did a similar analysis of spinning and non-spinning reserves, which is not included in this presentation, but it's in the report. And that analysis showed a much less of an impact and generally no to moderate impact with increasing VRE penetration. However, one important factor to keep in mind with these analyses is that probably the largest factor in dictating the price impacts is the assumption regarding how requirements will change with increasing VRE penetration. There's a fair amount of literature on that topic alone, and there isn't necessarily a strong consensus on exactly how to calculate or determine, for example, the increased frequency regulation requirements in systems with higher wind or solar penetration. So again, this is another metric that might be a little bit difficult to compare across different studies. All right, here we are looking at the revenue or profitability of different unit types that were analyzed by the studies. Plots are small, but hopefully the trends are reasonably apparent. And again, feel free to dig into the report for more detail. So different studies presented different metrics and included different costs and revenue streams in their calculations. So again, the height of the y-axis can be kind of broad, but focus more on the trends within each study. Some of these are strictly for revenue, while others are for operating profits, which include operating costs but not capital costs. And the broad trend, starting with nuclear in the upper left, is generally a decreasing trend, as is perhaps not surprising and has been discussed a lot recently with increasing VRE penetration. Similar impact for coal, although there are a couple studies that show a little bit less of a significant impact. Natural gas combined cycle is also a little bit mixed. There's one study that shows a fairly significant decrease, the topmost. The others show a moderate decline or maybe no impact. So a little bit less of an agreement there. And then for the combustion turbines, generally seeing neutral to no impact, and some even show a slight increase in revenue in higher VRE scenarios, generally because the combustion turbines are operated during periods of higher prices and aren't exposed to periods of zero or negative prices to the same extent. So again, these are broad trends, but not all studies included all potential revenue streams. Specifically, most included the energy market revenue, but not all included ancillary services or capacity markets, and different studies included different cost streams. So with that, I will pass it back to Andrew, I believe, who will go over some conclusions. Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Yeah, so as Todd said, I'll now just summarize with some of the key findings and then also talk a little bit about some of the future work that will build on this analysis. So what we saw is that there are examples where VRE is already starting to have an impact on the bulk power market, though one of the things we saw was that the impacts on average wholesale prices to date have been modest. And as such, the impact of VRE growth on retirements has also so far been limited, that we didn't see a clear correlation between VRE growth and the recent retirements that have occurred between 2010 and 2016. But as what the results from Todd demonstrated, the impact of VRE on both market power prices and on the dispatch of different assets is expected to grow as the penetration of these technologies also increases. These sort of changes are not completely unique to variable renewable energy resources, The bulk power system has evolved over time with changes in the generation fleet. And as in those cases, power system planners, operators, regulators, and policymakers will continue to be challenged to smoothly and cost-effectively manage the reliable integration of these new resources into the electricity supply. And throughout this document, we highlighted various future research needs, but here we'll focus on some of the near-term work that builds on this foundation. The first thing is that we plan on refining the supply curve analysis that was presented earlier. A few of the things that we'll be doing is to look at other data sources that we can find to help improve some of the sources that we were able to put together in a short timeline and increase the ability to really resolve these different factors that have changed over time. One example is the emissions prices. For example, we show what happens to emission permits prices for programs that were more on a national level, but we don't really have a lot of detail on what happened with some of the local pollution permit programs, such as in the South Coast area of California, or some local programs in Texas. So with a bit more time, we'll be able to go in and try to refine our representation of those changes that also occurred over this time frame. So we'll refine that analysis of CalISO and ERCOT, and then once we've got a little bit better handle on some of those data sources and refinements, we'll then also start to apply this to other ISO regions within the U.S. where we can find the data. And a lot of what this relies on is understanding what the different generators that are available in those regions are, but then also having these aggregate profiles of what the hourly wind and solar generation was during 2016 and previous years. So we'll be collecting that data from other places, applying the same simple supply curve model, and then hopefully what we'll see is that we'll be able to replicate again the observed average wholesale prices. And if this simple method doesn't work for replicating those wholesale prices in other ISO regions of the U.S., we'll have to think through other refinements. And again, this is just a very simple approach to doing that, and it worked in these particular cases because we were able to replicate those observed prices. But at some point, it might get where a simple supply curve doesn't really do justice, and we're not able to replicate that. And at that point, the recommendation might be to lean instead on more advanced production cost models or something like that that could reproduce issues that might be driving prices in those other regions. The other thing we'll do is that we'll use this simple supply curve model to try to do a forward look out over the next 5 years or so. So we have information about proposed generation retirements and new additions. We have forecasts of natural gas prices, of where those might go. We have a sense of what additional renewable generators might be added. And so we'll try to look forward from 2016 and say, if those changes occur, how much might we expect wholesale prices to change, and which factors are contributing to those changes in wholesale prices with that forward look. So we're in the process of scoping that out and starting that analysis. We hope to have some of that work done by the summer or so of 2018. At the same time, NREL will be doing some statistical analysis of historical prices. So the LBNL approach was to use sort of more of a bottoms-up approach where we were recreating the supply curve. And NREL is going to be doing something where they're using this more top-down approach where you're using econometric techniques to try to assess the drivers behind historical pricing patterns. So LBNL will be engaged with NREL in that process as more as an advisory role. But then at the end, we hope to have a summary paper that brings these complementary works together to identify some of the differences and conclusions between a top-down versus bottom-up approach, and to try to see if there's differences that can be explained, or if we sort of end up with similar conclusions from the two. We also plan to expand this analysis of VRE on historical price variability. In the main report, we focused primarily on observed negative prices in major trading hubs around the U.S. But as you saw, in particular locations, the story can be somewhat different, particularly when you're close to large amounts of renewable generators or behind transmission constraints. And so we plan to be spending more time trying to get a broader sense of those impacts across different parts of the U.S. and really try to add more fidelity to that locational story, and then also to look at the impacts of variable renewables on the temporal patterns of pricing. There's also work planned, in particular led by Argonne, to start looking at some of these questions more on the long-term expansion and how that affects the pricing impacts, and in particular some of these questions about how overall equilibrium might change with the addition of VRE and what effect that has on prices. They also plan to be looking at different VRE technologies and various other environmental incentive schemes to see how that will change some of the impacts of VRE on future systems. So with that, I think that wraps up the presentation of our content, and I'll now turn it over to Ryan to start going through the questions. And again, if you can, please enter your questions in the bottom left part of that chat box, and we'll start going through those with the remaining time that we have.
Great. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Todd and Auden as well. We do have a good amount of time for Q&A, so folks should feel free to insert comments into the Q&A box. I'll try to look at those, and we'll try to address them as we can. So we have a number of questions already. Let me walk through them. I'll answer some of them. This is Ryan again, of course, and then I'll also ask folks that also presented today to answer some other ones. One of the first questions we received early on in the presentation was, why wasn't reliability part of the scope? And to be clear, of course, many of the metrics and issues that we just addressed relate to reliability. So it's not as if reliability was completely out of the scope of this analysis, but we were not focused on specifically the short-term variability of wind and solar and the effects of that short-term variability on a technical basis for reliability. And so reliability was sort of partially in scope, not fully in scope, and the reason for that was pretty simple. We had basically 3 weeks in which to do most of the work that was just presented to you, and we were very much following instructions from the DOE folks leading the grid study in what we were to cover versus other analysis teams. So hopefully that responds to that question. Let me answer one other of the questions, and then I'll start asking my co-authors and co-presenters some of the other ones. A couple of questions relate to the retirements analysis that we did and, in effect, how robust our findings were. And what I'd like to emphasize here is that we didn't find any generalizable relationship between the amount of retirements, recent retirements that was occurring on a regional basis in the U.S. relative to VRE penetration. That is, those regions of the country, California and ERCOT, for example, that have high VRE penetrations did not tend to have higher amounts of retirements. And so we can certainly say with some confidence that the historical data don't suggest a particularly strong relationship between thermal plant retirements and VRE penetration. That's not to say that there aren't individual projects that have been impacted. The Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California, for example, certainly it's PG&E's decision to retire that plant in the future is driven at least in part by the very strong renewable energy programs and policies of the state, among other factors. So we certainly don't claim that there's no relationship there, but we do claim that we don't observe a large-scale effect, at least so far. And that makes sense in light of some of the results that Andrew showed, which demonstrate that at least historically, VRE really hasn't had much of an impact on wholesale power prices, at least in terms of annual average prices at major pricing hubs. Really, natural gas is the biggest part of that story. And so consequent to that, the decrease in natural gas prices and the effect of that on wholesale power prices and suppressing those wholesale prices certainly has a much larger effect on a large-scale basis on retirements than does VRE. So hopefully that at least to some degree, resolves that question as well. The next one might be for both Andrew and the Argonne folks, and it is basically whether the price suppression effect, and specifically the idea that that suppression might ease somewhat as capacity equilibrates, whether that effect has really been seen in the real world, or whether instead that's a modeling finding, but not necessarily one that we've observed with real market data. Maybe Andrew, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with that, and then Auden and Todd, please join in too. So I think the challenge is in order to get a real-world observation of that, it's really something where you need a counterfactual to compare that to. If you're saying that you expect that in the long run equilibrium that price suppression would ease, you have to know what the price suppression would be without that easing, and then what would it be with the retirements. And so it's just from an empirical perspective, it's pretty challenging just because that's sort of a very long-term issue. And so it's more challenging. But what you could look at, and so we don't have any clear evidence of that, but what you could look at is to think through what is it that drives that price suppression to ease in the modeling that's being done. And really what's happening is that the addition of VRE, as it is added to the system, starts to change the incentives to invest in different power plants. And in particular, you start to see an increase in sort of the attractiveness of a plant that has lower capital costs, which also might mean that it has higher fuel prices. And so what you can look for is you can see as VRE is added, do you start to shift away from a resource that has high capital costs and very low fuel costs and start to shift instead towards resources that have lower capital costs and higher fuel costs. And what happens is that if you start to have more and more resources that have those high fuel costs being added, then if they're on the margin at times, then that will start to increase the price relative to what it would have been had those lower fuel cost plants been built instead. So I guess what we can look for is a real world example to look for is a shifting in the type of generation that's being invested. And we didn't in detail try to explore that particularly, but I guess that's what I would say you could look for as a real world evidence.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And maybe one more question for you while you're in the spirit of answering questions. One question came in about why we selected 2008 as basically the starting point for our analysis of the effective VRE on wholesale prices. And had we selected a different starting point year, would we imagine that we would have found particularly different results in terms of the relative effect of wind and solar?
Sure, that's a great question. So if you, in the introductory slides that Ryan started to go through, just in the context of what we've seen, there's this slide that he has that shows the average wholesale prices across the U.S. Starting back, I think, towards 2006 or so and going all the way out till 2016. And if you look at that, you see that 2008 is the time period where we saw prices were at their highest, and 2016 is at the time period when prices were at their lowest. So what we were trying to do is explain that change that we had observed, and those were the two time frames that sort of bounded the observed change in wholesale prices, and that's why we chose those. But if we were to have chosen a different year to be comparing to 2016, I think the first thing is that there would just be a lower overall change to explain in that part. So we would see less of a overall change. And in particular, since we saw that a lot of that was due to natural gas, if you go to a year like 2012, for example, where natural gas prices were considerably lower than 2008, and you compare 2012 to 2016, then natural gas price decline between 2012 and 2016 was relatively small, so we would see a relatively small contribution of natural gas to the price change between those 2 years, whereas we would have seen the growth in renewables. It probably would have still been comparable to the magnitude of what we measured, that sort of few dollars a megawatt hour that we measured in our results. So the relative contribution would change because the absolute change was much smaller.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. A question now for the Argonne crew, sort of a detailed in-the-weeds question, but maybe you can offer a kind of a generic response. Basically, a number of the slides that you guys presented have some asterisks in them that denote differences between one study and the next, and someone was interested in understanding a bit more about what those asterisks denote in particular.
Yeah, sure, I can field this one. So those were I believe those are referring to the asterisks in the legends of the figures, and those distinguish between different assumptions that were used. So there's more detail in the full report, but off the top of my head, one distinguished between the load-weighted average LMP and the simple average LMP. And then on the slides with profit and revenue numbers, it distinguished between studies that considered operating profit versus revenue. And those are the two I can think of off the top of my head. If there are more, the details would be in the report.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Maybe a couple that I will answer here. One question about the so-called value decline related to solar. And we've done some work here at LBL with others on our team that have looked at the basically the output-weighted LMP prices or locational marginal prices associated with solar in CALISO versus the time-weighted average prices. And that analysis shows that the value of solar in the CALISO market relative to a flat baseload block has declined over time. And so someone who is interested to understand why we have not included aspects of that analysis into this work. So the response to that is, actually we have included that in this work. However, it's included in that mysterious Chapter 5 that I mentioned early on we would not be covering in today's webinar. And so if you're interested in understanding some of the implications of this work for the so-called system value of variable renewables, or alternatively the system costs of variable renewables, I certainly invite folks to review Chapter 5. And again, apologize that we didn't cover that in today's webinar. We just had too much other stuff to cover for this purpose. Another question came in that I will address before turning some others over to others on the team here. Is what specific direction we received from DOE in conducting this work. And I mean, DOE's role was really useful here across the board. On the one hand, of course, they provided funding to do work that we were keen to do, for sure. They were specifically interested in the issues that we have just addressed, the impacts of variable renewables on the bulk power market, both in terms of the pricing decisions, operational decisions, and investment and retirement decisions. They were also interested in the system costs and system value aspects. And so the chapters that are included in this report very much derived in large measure due to specific interest from the folks at the Department of Energy. But other than that, there wasn't really any particular intervention by DOE except for providing funding and some general direction, and then of course offering a large number of excellent questions and comments on our work that helped us refine our language and our analysis at later steps. One question maybe for you, Andrew. To what extent did we consider or do we plan to consider expanding RPS goals that drive VRE expansion in our analysis?
Sorry, Ryan, was that question was, did we consider expanding RPS goals in our previous, or is that it for the future look that we plan?
Both. Basically,
okay.
Did we do it, or do we have plans to do it, in effect?
Yeah, so in the historical, we didn't separate out renewable growth that was due to an RPS from renewable growth that might have happened outside of an RPS. So we're looking at the total amount of VRE that's been added. Of course, a portion of that, a large portion of that is driven by meeting RPS goals. And so RPS goals are one of the drivers that's adding renewables, and then we're then measuring the impact that those renewables have on pricing. But aside from that, we don't go into any particulars on the RPS programs or how those policies themselves are affecting these results. And then when we're looking and doing the forward look, we'll need to be coming up with some sort of projection as to what future renewables will be in the next 5 years or so. And in that same way that because RPS policies are driving a large portion of the renewables growth that we've seen so far, we'll be gauging that based on RPS policies. We'll also be looking for other sources of renewable demand and announced plans for folks to be meeting corporate procurement goals or other factors that might be happening outside of an RPS.
So maybe just to add to that in the forward-looking studies that we looked at from Argon's end. So oftentimes there is like a defined level of renewables that the models assume has to be met at a certain point in time, and those can be driven by renewable portfolio goals or other policies or market mechanisms. So to some extent, they may be reflected in some of the reports we were talking about. And also just one comment on the previous discussion on retirement. It's also important to keep in mind that the load growth in the U.S. power grid has been almost non-existent in the last 10 years. That's also an underlying driver for why some plants are closing down. I just wanted to add that into the discussion here.
Great. Thanks, Audun. And another question, I'm not sure I totally understand this question, but maybe some of the rest of our authors will, or at least can respond in a way that is potentially directionally correct. Are the prices in the report, as well as those planned in future research, ex ante or ex post?
I actually don't know the answer to the question, and I wonder if Audun and Todd can help out with this too. But for our analysis, what we did was that we relied very heavily on the Velocity Suite database, which collects a lot of this pricing data from across the U.S. at different ISO markets. So what we're using is what was reported by the ISOs, and that Velocity Suite then aggregated. And then we're taking that from the real-time market. Now, whether that's ex ante or ex post, I actually don't know the specific answer to that question. And
I can weigh in for the
Go ahead.
Well, for the future-looking studies, I can try to weigh in. The answer for that would be it would depend on the study. I would guess, venture overall, that most of these studies don't use models that don't actually replicate the market process. They're more of least cost models that approximate the economic outcome. So I don't know if there's a perfect corollary there, but my impression is that it would be more closely resemble the ex ante prices.
Great, thanks. And the final question, I'm trying to interpret it a little bit here and maybe rephrase it a little bit, but really addresses this issue of capacity equilibration and the degree to which at higher levels of variable renewable energy, power systems will tend to move in the direction of building generation and or load that is more flexible, which oftentimes will mean lower or higher fuel costs, but lower capital cost. And the kind of natural implication of that on existing thermal generation plants that have potentially lower fuel costs, but higher capital costs. And I guess the only point here, again, I'm not entirely sure what exactly the question is, but the general finding from a lot of analysis has demonstrated, perhaps not surprisingly, that as variable renewable energy increases, because of the effect on market prices and the operation of thermal units, the generation resource mix will tend to favor flexible things. And that's flexible things both on the generation side of the equation, but also on the load side of the equation. And naturally, that also means that if you're an existing plant that does not have the flexible characteristics that are now to a greater extent desired at higher levels of variable renewable energy, your profit margins and revenues will tend to decline more rapidly than other generation types. And that finding has certainly been discovered in many modeling studies and is supported certainly by the work that the Argonne crew did within the context of this particular study. And with that, we are just about at the end of our 75 minutes. We are also at the end of the questions that were received. And so I think I'd like to end the call. I would like to thank all of the speakers on the call, as well as, of course, the participants of the webinar. I would remind folks again that if you want all of the gory details of this work, the two reports are available for your review. They're both linked on the slide that's up at present. And if you're interested in contacting the authors, either Audun or myself, you can see our information there. Of course, you also feel free to contact Todd or Andrew, who are really the brains behind this operation to some extent. And again, thanks, and I wish all of you a happy holiday season. Bye-bye.